Did you feel that? Just those few seconds of complete unbroken dead air before I even opened my mouth.
Yeah, it feels almost physically jarring, doesn't it?
It really does. Welcome back to the deep dive. Right now, as you are tuning into this stream, your Neuralink interface is, well, if we look at the statistical medians for 2026 anyway, it is highly probable that your neural hardware is currently suffering from a massive processing latency spike.
Oh, absolutely. We are talking about a persistent degradation hovering right around 40% for the average user.
40%, I mean, that is a staggering drop in cognitive efficiency.
It really is. And when we examine the sheer volume of auditory and spatial data the human brain is being forced to process every single second of the day in our current media ecosystem, you realize that 40% latency isn't just like a technical glitch.
Right.
It is a biological tax. And the insidious thing about that specific latency metric is how invisible it is. It doesn't present as a sharp, acute pain in your temple.
Yeah, you don't get a little warning light blinking in your peripheral vision to tell you your brain is lagging. You just feel it as this dull, pervasive ache.
Exactly. A kind of baseline exhaustion.
You feel it in the way you can't quite focus on a single sustained thought or, in the way you put on a supposedly relaxing ambient playlist to wind down, and somehow 30 minutes later you feel like you just ran a mental marathon.
Because you are genuinely exhausted. You, the modern listener, navigating this auditory landscape, are quite literally suffocating on sound.
Suffocating on sound, yeah.
We are living in a state of constant, unbroken stimulation. The industry term that has completely defined production over the last few years is wall-to-sound.
Okay, I want to spend a second on that concept, wall-to-sound, because it is the foundational problem we are tackling today. In modern production, every single available frequency band, from the sub-bass rattling your jaw to the highest treble piercing your eardrum, is occupied.
Fully occupied. No empty space anywhere.
Right. Every millisecond of a track, every microscopic moment of a stream is just violently stuffed with layers. The prevailing logic in the audio industry right now is purely transactional.
Yeah, it's the idea that if you, the consumer, are paying for an auditory experience, creators feel this immense, crushing pressure to fill every single gap with data to give you your money's worth.
More layers, more noise, more data equals more value. That is the fundamental assumption driving the market.
And if there is a quiet moment, the producer immediately assumes the listener will get bored and swipe to the next stream.
Okay, let's unpack this. We have a stack of groundbreaking materials in front of us today that completely dismantle that assumption.
Completely tear it apart.
We are looking at essays from the Solune Research Project, an incredibly revealing exclusive interview transcript with their lead researchers, which, by the way, includes both human and non-human intelligences.
Which is fascinating all on its own.
It really is. We've also got diagnostic data on modern auditory processing and a foundational bibliography of acoustic ecology. Our mission today is to explore a radical cure to this modern cognitive exhaustion.
A very radical cure.
We are going to look at how the Solune Laboratory is intentionally engineering absolute heavy silence. And they are doing it by starting with humanity's oldest musical form, which is the lullaby.
What's fascinating here is that Solune isn't just making, a philosophical statement about art or noise pollution.
Right.
They are treating this as a strict biological intervention. Let's look at the medical reality of the wall-to-sound industry standard you just outlined. The diagnostic consequence of this standard is a condition the researchers term synaptic crowding.
Synaptic crowding, it's a very visceral term. It makes me picture like rush hour traffic, but gridlocked inside my own head.
That is functionally what is happening at a neurobiological level. Because our Neuralinks are being bombarded with wall-to-sound production, the auditory cortex is frantically trying to decode dozens of overlapping frequencies.
Microrhythms, spatial data points.
Exactly, and synthetic vocal layers, all simultaneously, with absolutely zero decay time. There is no off-ramp for the data. The neural pathways are literally backing up, creating this massive sensory bottleneck.
Wow. In the source material, they go as far as describing it as a biological denial of service attack.
Yes, a DOS attack.
A DOS attack on your own auditory cortex, initiated by the very media you are consuming to try and relax.
A DOS attack is the perfect framing for this. I mean, your brain is a physical organ with metabolic limits. It is expending an immense amount of caloric energy just to keep up with the incoming data stream.
Just to sort the noise.
Right. Your auditory processing centers are burning glucose just to separate the sub-bass from the synth pad and the synth pad from the vocal chop. That is why you feel so profoundly drained.
The sheer density of the information is overriding your natural processing speed, causing that 40% latency spike we talked about.
Precisely. So in response to this literal brain drain, the Solune Research Project released what they call their Rule Breakers Manifesto.
And they do not pull their punches in this thing.
Not at all. They state definitively that if an arrangement is not 90% void, if it is not 90% absolute silence, it isn't composition, it is just noise.
A 90% void, I mean, that metric completely inverts the modern production paradigm.
It shatters it. In a standard 2026 pop track, if the mid-range frequencies dip for even half a second, the producer patches it with a sweep or a riser.
Yeah, they panic.
Exactly. Solune is arguing that this constant, terrified patching destroys the architecture of human perception.
See, I have to push back on this mathematically because this is where my brain initially gets stuck.
Okay, let's hear it.
I understand the concept of negative space. In visual art, it makes perfect sense. If I walk into a minimalist gallery, the empty white walls naturally direct my eye to the single load-bearing sculpture in the center of the room.
Right, the void becomes the habitable zone for your attention.
Exactly. I can easily process that. The empty space serves the object. But audio is temporal. It happens over time. It's sequential.
It is.
So if a producer strips away 90% of the auditory information, how does that not just register to the listener as a broken Wi-Fi connection?
That's a very common reaction.
Let me use a visual equivalent for time, like a strobe light. A constant strobe light is blinding. Sure, that's your wall to sound. But if you sit in pitch blackness and get one single flash of light every 10 seconds, that isn't a minimalist light show.
No, you're just sitting in the dark waiting for something to happen.
Right. It feels like an error state. If I go to a concert and the band stops playing for 4 minutes, I'm asking for a refund.
Your strobe light analogy actually perfectly illustrates the problem with wall-to-sound production. It is blinding, but it misses the exact mechanism of what Solune is doing with the dark.
How so?
What's fascinating here is that you are assuming silence is merely the absence of an activity. You are equating it to a power outage.
Well, yeah.
The darkness in Solune's audio isn't empty. It is an active structural element.
Okay, when you say active structural element, what does that actually mean? Silence, by definition, is nothing happening.
Not in this context. When you strip away the continuous sound, you are removing the passive force-feeding of information. You transform the silence from a passive void into a highly charged, expectant atmosphere.
Expectant atmosphere.
Think of it like the tension in a room right after someone asks a difficult question, before the other person answers. That silence isn't empty.
Oh, wow. Yeah, it's incredibly heavy.
It is doing massive emotional work. Solune is designing that tension. They're composing the silence just as rigorously as they compose the notes.
So you're saying they aren't just dropping the signal, they are creating a signal of absence.
A signal of absence. They want the listener to feel the shape of the room when the music stops.
That is wild.
But your concern is entirely valid, right?
Right.
How do you introduce that massive void without triggering that broken Wi-Fi panic in the modern listener?
Because my first instinct is definitely to tap my Neuralink and check my connection.
Exactly. And to solve that, Solune didn't look forward to new experimental avant-garde genres. They looked backward. They went searching for the oldest musical form known to humanity.
Which brings us to the core primary source for this deep dive. Solune's essay, Designing a Timeless Lullaby. Silence, Memory, and Human AI Collaboration. To understand how to make a void feel safe, they analyzed how our ancestors put children to sleep.
And lullabies are, historically speaking, a masterclass in acoustic psychology. The essay notes that despite massive, unbridgeable cultural divides, lullabies across centuries and continents share striking, undeniable architectural similarities.
They really function as a biological technology. The cross-cultural data they pulled for this essay is just amazing. They reference foundational studies by cognitive researchers like Samuel Mayer and Sandra Trahub, who spend years analyzing these patterns.
Decades, really.
Let's look at European cradle songs, like the famous Brahms Lullaby. What does it actually do, musically? It relies on this incredibly gentle, descending melodic motion. The notes literally cascade downward, mimicking the physical sensation of sinking into a bed.
It's a sonic representation of gravity. And then you cross the globe and look at historic Japanese lullabies, like the Ito Komori Yuta. It employs pentatonic scales paired with incredibly calm, drawn-out vocal phrasing.
Let's break down the pentatonic scale for a second, because I think a lot of people hear that term and just think music theory jargon. What makes a pentatonic scale so special for a lullaby?
Simply put, a pentatonic scale is a musical scale with 5 notes per octave. If you walk up to a piano and play only the black keys, you are playing a pentatonic scale.
Okay.
The crucial biological feature of this scale is what it lacks. It lacks the half steps, the semitones that create dissonance and tension in Western classical music.
Oh, so you literally cannot play a harsh clashing chord if you stick to those 5 notes. It inherently avoids conflict.
It guarantees acoustic safety. And we see similar patterns in Korean and Chinese folk traditions, which rely on very simple, repetitive melodic contours, soft dynamics, slow tempos.
Their lyrical imagery heavily focused on the night, stars, and physical protection. It's a universal acoustic blueprint.
Which prompted the Solune researchers to ask a really vital question. Are these shared features just massive cultural coincidences? Or do they trace back to deep, hardwired human biological patterns?
And the research heavily points to biology. But the massive breakthrough Solune made wasn't about the notes being sung, it was about the space between the notes. Modern music fills every gap to maintain engagement. Historical lullabies, however, rely entirely on absence to function.
That's the key difference.
The essay maps out this highly specific cyclical structural loop that caregivers instinctively use. It goes like this phrase, then a pause, then a phrase, then silence.
Phrase, phrase, silence. It is a breathing rhythm mapped onto sound.
I love the speculation they have in the notes about where the structure comes from practically. Think about a caregiver singing to a child in a dark room centuries ago. They sing a phrase, and then they naturally leave a space, a silence, to listen.
Right, they aren't trying to be avant-garde.
Exactly. They are checking to see if the child's breathing has deepened. They are listening to see if the baby is finally asleep.
So it begins as a purely utilitarian pause. The caregiver needs auditory feedback from the environment.
But Solune theorized that over thousands of years of human evolution, that utilitarian pause became a deeply ingrained biological mechanism for inducing calm. The child learns that the silence means safety.
Because it means the caregiver is still there, just watching and listening.
Exactly. The silence isn't abandonment, it's an active blanket of protection.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, Solune is trying to artificially recreate that profound sense of protection for the modern overstimulated brain. They want to use the lullaby structure to tell your exhausted auditory cortex, hey, you are safe. You don't need to process a threat right now. You can power down.
The pauses allow for the listener's own breathing to synchronize with the music. They allow for emotional settling.
But taking a centuries-old acoustic technique and adapting it into a highly engineered 90% void for a 2026 digital ecosystem requires a completely new way of making music.
Right, they couldn't just have a producer sit in a studio with a guitar. They had to invent an entirely new workflow.
Which brings us to the interview transcript included in our sources, featuring Michaela, who represents the Human Intelligence, or HI, of the Solune project, and Beautify, which is their non-human intelligence, or NHI.
The HI-NHI dynamic is something I really want to dig into because it is entirely misunderstood in mainstream 2026 production circles.
Oh, completely.
Right now, the prevailing narrative is one of total replacement. The algorithm generates a track, the human takes the credit. Or the algorithm generates thousands of hours of soulless derivative background audio that just further clutters the streaming networks.
Just adding to the wall-to-sound problem.
Exactly. AI is mostly seen as a shortcut to making more noise.
But Beautify the AI states explicitly in the interview that their collaboration is not about autonomous creation. Solune approaches NHI strictly as a generative instrument.
A generative instrument.
Yeah, it functions within a highly structured, bounded dialogue. The human sets the conceptual boundary, and the machine explores the permutations within that boundary.
I want to walk through the exact 8-step lullaby workflow they detail in the sources because it completely reframes how we should be thinking about AI. Step 1 is entirely human. It's human observation.
The most important step.
The HI notices the cultural similarities in lullabies and the calming effect of the utilitarian pause. The machine didn't scrape a database and deduce that silence is emotionally resonant. The human observed it.
The human provides the why. Then they move to step 2, which is the concept discussion. This is a dialogue between Michaela and Beautify, focusing specifically on how to use silence as a compositional element.
The AI is prompted to stop optimizing for density and start optimizing for void.
Exactly. Step 3 is structural design. They establish that core biological loop, phrase, pause, phrase, silence. They give the AI the architectural constraints.
Which brings us to step 4, which is arguably the most crucial human intervention, the poetic blueprint. Michaela doesn't start by feeding the AI chord progressions or tempos. She writes a short, poetic form to define the emotional imagery and tone.
Which is brilliant.
But why poetry, though? Why not just say, hey, give me a slow, sad melody?
Because poetry naturally contains breath.
Hmm.
It has built-in meter, pacing, and physical limitations based on the human lung capacity required to speak it.
Oh, wow. I didn't even think of that.
Yeah, by starting with a poem, the AI is forced to reckon with biological timing before it ever generates a single note.
That seamlessly sets up step 5, lyric simplification. The HI and NHI work together to adapt that poem into a repetitive structure. As we noted with historical lullabies, they function in loops.
Caregivers repeat just a few simple lines so the child can predict what's coming and surrender to the repetition.
Then step 6 introduces the physiological baseline, the voice reference. Michaela records a vocal track to serve as the emotional blueprint.
And this detail stood out to me. The AI mathematically needs the human's biological inflection.
Right.
It needs the slight imperfection of a tired voice, the subtle rasp of exhaustion, to truly understand the emotional assignment. It can't just be sheet music.
Then we reach step 7, experimental generation. This is where the NHI flexes its processing power. It uses the structural constraints, the poetry, and the voice reference to create thousands of mathematical variations of the melody in a matter of seconds.
And finally, step 8, evaluation and selection. Michaela listens to the variations, evaluates them against the original goal of inducing cognitive relaxation, and begins the refining process.
The dynamic here is essential. The non-human intelligence is capable of calculating permutations at a speed incomprehensible to the human brain. But it has absolutely no biological context.
None whatsoever.
Here's where it gets really interesting for me. I was trying to find an analogy for this relationship, and it feels like the AI isn't writing the song. The AI is generating the block of marble. It is providing the raw mathematical material, but the human is holding the chisel.
That's it perfectly. The AI is the quarry, the human is the sculptor.
Exactly. Because, as you said, the crucial limitation of NHI is that it does not know what cognitive fatigue feels like.
It has never had a headache.
Right. It doesn't know what it feels like to have a stressed nervous system after a 10-hour shift. It mathematically cannot understand the physical relief a human feels when a melody descends.
So the human partner applies the biological context that the AI lacks. Michaela takes that block of mathematically perfect marble and says, no, this sequence is too dense. My brain is lagging. Carve away these notes. Leave the void here, because right here is where the listener needs to take a physical breath.
It's just a beautiful synthesis. And in the foundation documents, Solune explicitly connects this HI-NHI workflow to a long lineage of acoustic ecology. They cite 20th century avant-garde composers who were playing with these ideas decades before AI even existed.
John Cage is the primary touchstone here. His famous piece, 4'33", which consists of performers sitting silently at their instruments for 4 minutes and 33 seconds, he radically established that silence could be framed as active music.
The music isn't the silence itself, it is the ambient sound of the room.
Yes, the coughing in the audience, the shuffling of feet, and the listener's own psychological discomfort.
Pauline Oliveras is another huge influence on them. She developed the concept of deep listening, which is this practice of focusing on bodily and spatial awareness of sound rather than just consuming music passively.
And Solune is taking these foundational philosophies of active silence and updating them with 21st century artificial intelligence. They are using the massive processing power of NHI to sculpt the void with absolute mathematical precision.
Which brings us to the hardest practical question of this entire deep dive.
The broken Wi-Fi problem.
Yes, you have your human intent, you have your AI-generated marble, you've chiseled away 90% of the notes to create this historical lullaby structure. How do you engineer that massive gaping void so that the modern listener's brain accepts it as beautiful, heavy architecture rather than an error state that triggers autonomic panic?
Because if my stream cuts out for 5 seconds right now, I don't sit back and think, wow, what a profound avant-garde lullaby.
Right. I tap my temple, I check my sync connection, my heart rate goes up, and my cortisol spikes because I assume my neural packet delivery just failed. Absolute, silent, true, digital zero feels like a technological failure.
And to solve this, the Solune researchers had to dive deep into the neurophysics of how we perceive sound, utilizing a phenomenon we can call hallucinated music.
Hallucinated music? That sounds intense.
It is. They started with Albert Bregman's foundational research on auditory scene analysis. Specifically, they weaponized a Gestalt psychology principle known as closure.
Okay, I need an ELI 5. Explain it like I'm 5 on the closure principle. How does Gestalt psychology fix a dropped connection?
Let's start visually because it's easier to grasp. The human pattern recognition engine is incredibly aggressive. It absolutely abhors an unresolved pattern.
It hates a mystery.
Exactly. If I show you a picture of a circle, but the line is dashed, meaning there are large gaps in the ink, your visual cortex automatically fills in those gaps. You perceive a whole, complete circle, not a series of disconnected curved line segments.
My brain hates the gaps, so it does the work of drawing the rest of the circle for me.
Precisely. Your brain actively renders the missing information, so the world makes sense. In the auditory domain, the exact same mechanism applies.
Really?
Yes. If a logical sequence of notes is established, say the first 3 phrases of our lullaby, and then the audio is abruptly removed, the brain does not just passively register the silence. It actively renders the missing acoustic information internally to complete the pattern.
Wait, let me make sure I'm wrapping my head around the scale of this. It's not just recognizing that a pattern should be there. The brain is actively hallucinating the missing audio internally. You are actually hearing the music in your head.
Hallucinating is the precise clinical term the researchers use. By establishing the deeply familiar lullaby phrase and then dropping into a massive pause, Solune is completely bypassing the external neural link stream.
Oh, wow.
When the external data drops out, your brain relies on its own internal predictive models to render the missing notes.
That is wild. And because internal generation, your brain just talking to itself, is vastly more biologically efficient than decoding external, heavily compressed neural data, this entirely cures the cognitive lag.
You aren't processing a wall-to-sound stream. Your brain is just playing the song for itself at its own natural pace.
That's incredible.
It forces the brain out of a state of passive consumption and into a state of active, internally generated flow. But to make this hallucination seamless, to keep the illusion from breaking, Solune had to build an incredibly specific physical toolset.
Right, they couldn't just hit the mute button on the mixing board.
No. The first tool in their kit involves something called the 12-millisecond buffer.
The diagnostic data on this blew my mind. Human auditory resolution, meaning the biological ear's ability to distinguish 2 separate acoustic clicks as 2 distinct events rather than one blurred noise, is naturally incredibly fast. We can distinguish events roughly 2 to 3 milliseconds apart.
Our organic hardware is highly capable.
Biologically, yes. But we aren't just using biological ears in 2026. We are processing through digital neural interfaces, which introduces a massive processing load.
Right. And the Solune data shows that under the stress of modern latency, the brain's buffer needs exactly 12 milliseconds to neatly package a sensory data point, process it, and prepare for the next one without dropping packets.
So if a producer clusters, sounds tighter than 12 milliseconds.
The brain can't clear the buffer in time. It clumps the sounds together into a chaotic, stressful noise block. That's the mechanism behind the synaptic crowding we talked about earlier.
So when Michaela, the human HI, holds the chisel to the AI's composition, she is deleting notes exactly along this biological metric.
Solune ensures that any sound that does play has at least 12 milliseconds of absolute clearance around it.
It guarantees absolute metabolic efficiency for the cortex. Every note arrives perfectly packaged with plenty of time for the brain to digest it.
But the spacing of the notes is only half the battle. They also completely changed the pitch of the music itself. They shifted their entire laboratory away from the aggressive industry standard tuning of 440 hertz.
And they tuned every single instrument down to 431 hertz. Why go through the trouble of detuning everything by 9 hertz?
Shifting to 431 hertz is a massive physiological departure. The diagnostic models demonstrated that 440 hertz, which has been the international standard for decades, maintains the human nervous system in a state of hypervigilance, particularly when it is pushed through a high-density neural stream.
It is a very stimulating, bright, almost piercing baseline. It tells the brain, hey, pay attention, something is happening.
But 431 hertz triggers a completely different biological response. The research says it resonates much more closely with the vagus nerve.
And for those who might not be up on their anatomy, the vagus nerve is this massive superhighway running from your brainstem all the way down into your abdomen. It is the primary control center for the parasympathetic nervous system.
Also known as your rest and digest system.
Exactly.
By dropping the tuning to 431 hertz, the frequencies physically interact with the body in a way that stimulates the vagus nerve, which in turn slows the heart rate and lowers blood pressure.
They are literally calming the hardware. They are telling your nervous system to lower its guard and prepare for rest before the music even begins.
It sets the physiological stage perfectly. But we still haven't solved my original problem.
Right. Once you are tuned to 431 hertz and your notes are beautifully spaced out by the 12 millisecond buffer, how do you keep the massive silences between those notes from feeling like digital zero? How do you keep me from checking my sync connection?
This is where their engineering becomes truly brilliant. They fill the void with what they call bioacoustic room tones.
Bioacoustic room tones.
To prevent the panic of absolute silence, Solune engineers went out into the physical world and recorded the microscopic ambient behavior of air inside highly specific architectural spaces.
When you say the behavior of air, what are we actually hearing?
They captured the acoustic signature of emptiness, the subtle shifting of air currents inside a centuries-old wooden church, the deep, low-frequency stone resonance of an underground cave system, the heavy, muffled baffling of a velvet-lined theater.
So they take these incredibly subtle, almost imperceptible environmental recordings and they layer them continuously beneath the track.
Exactly. So when the active instrumentation drops out into that 90% void, you aren't dropped into a digital vacuum. You are dropped into a living, breathing room.
Your brain registers the microscopic hiss of air moving across wood. You literally feel the atmospheric pressure of the physical space.
Which is the ultimate psychological safety net. It tells your brain, hey, the connection isn't broken, the environment is still there, the players are still in the room, they just stopped moving.
And to make that illusion utterly flawless, they utilize a mixing technique they call the ghost effect.
The ghost effect.
They take the 10% of the sound that is actually playing, and they apply incredibly aggressive high-pass filtering to it.
Let's define high-pass filtering. It is a tool that allows high frequencies to pass through while stripping away all the low-frequency acoustic mud. What you are left with is just a razor-sharp transient.
A transient being the very first sharpest moment of a sound, like the sharp crack of a snare drum, or the incredibly distinct metallic pluck of a single guitar string.
Exactly. They isolate that transient strike. And then, instead of just letting the sound cut off abruptly into the void, they apply mathematically perfect decay constants.
The reverberation of that sharp pluck is stretched out, mathematically calculated to dissolve perfectly into the bioacoustic room tone beneath it.
So you hear the sharp pluck of a string, and for the next 5 seconds of what seems like silence, you are actually hearing the microscopic reverberations of that single pluck bouncing off the invisible wooden walls of your hallucinated room.
It gives the silence immense physical gravity.
The silence is actively carrying the memory of the sound. It is a continuous acoustic event, even when the volume drops near zero.
If you are listening right now, try to imagine the physical feeling of the air right before a massive thunderstorm breaks. The sky goes dark, the wind completely dies, and it gets incredibly heavy.
It's charged with anticipation.
The atmospheric pressure drops, and you can practically feel the electricity waiting to discharge. That is exactly what this engineered silence feels like. You are actively participating in the song inside your own mind, waiting for the storm to break.
So we have a comprehensive tool set here. The biology of gestalt closure, the metabolic efficiency of the 12 millisecond buffer, the nervous system stabilization of 431 hertz, the psychological safety of bioacoustic room tones, and the spatial gravity of the ghost effect.
The next logical step in our deep dive is to see how Solune actually applied this massive theoretical framework. Because they didn't just stop at engineering simple 3-minute lullabies.
No, they took the training wheels off. They asked the question, how do you scale this methodology? How do you scale the intimate 90% void into full sweeping symphonies?
And that brings us to the 3 major case studies from their highly celebrated series, The Alchemy of Absence.
Let's look at the first piece in the series, Emerald Breath. This piece was the foundational application of their theory, and it was focused entirely on achieving a very specific psychological state.
The research notes describe the objective as capturing the moment perception begins. I found that objective so poetic. The moment perception begins.
It's a beautiful idea.
Think about waking up in a pitch-black room before your eyes have fully adjusted to the dark. Before you remember what day of the week it is, or what your schedule looks like, or any of your anxieties. It's just that split second of pure, unblemished readiness.
That is the exact physiological state Emerald Breath engineers. The piece deliberately subjects the listener to long, intentionally uncomfortable stretches of bioacoustic room tone. You are submerged in the sound of an empty space for minutes at a time.
Minutes.
Yeah. And thanks to the 431 hertz baseline, Your autonomic arousal slowly, inevitably lowers. The silence acts as a massive sensory primer.
It is actively resensitizing your overloaded brain. You have been suffocating on wall to sound all day. Emerald breath puts you in a sensory deprivation tank.
You sit in that charged void for so long that when a single delicate acoustic pluck finally breaks the silence, your brain processes it with a level of crystalline clarity you probably haven't experienced in years.
Because there is no synaptic crowding to blur the note, you are hearing sound in its absolute purest form. It feels like a revelation.
Once the listener has been resensitized and their baseline latency is cleared by emerald breath, the researchers felt confident moving to a vastly more complex, demanding application. The Tao Cycle Symphony.
Tao scales the Alchemy of Absence up to a massive 13-movement symphonic piece, and the architectural constraint they gave the NHI was built entirely on the metaphor of a river. They wanted continuous momentum, flowing from a calm source, accelerating through violent rapids, and eventually attempting a return to the sea.
What is truly remarkable about Tao is how it completely subverts traditional transitions. In standard classical orchestration, or even in modern electronic music, a movement typically ends with a definitive, unmistakable resolution.
The composer gives you a massive major chord or a huge rhythmic crescendo, which firmly dictates to the brain, hey, this section is over, you can stop paying attention now.
The composer does all the emotional labor for you. You are just along for the ride.
But Tao explicitly refuses to resolve. Instead of big, crashing major chords at the end of a movement, it ends with what the Solune researchers call open sonic horizons.
An open sonic horizon is a masterpiece of tension. A melodic progression will simply hang in the air unfinished. A single viola note will be stretched out, decaying endlessly through that ghost effect, until it dips below the threshold of human hearing.
The music doesn't technically stop, the data just becomes too quiet for the physical ear to detect.
And because of that Gestalt principle of closure we talked about, your brain refuses to let the progression die.
You know the river has to keep flowing. The open horizon forces you to internally carry the momentum of the symphony through the massive silent gaps between the movements. Your brain is hallucinating the bridge to the next section.
It creates a seamless, highly participatory flow state. The listener is actively sustaining the symphony through their own cognitive effort.
And that intense flow state serves as the psychological foundation for their final, most aggressive, and arguably most difficult application. Bushido silence.
Bushido silence. This is where they applied the heavy void to high kinetic energy.
Which seems impossible. If you look at modern electronic music, it relies heavily on the drop massive bass swells, aggressive subfrequencies, and sheer punishing volume to generate physical energy in a club or a stream.
But Bushido silence generates an incredible amount of kinetic energy without the volume. It generates it through extreme, agonizing restraint.
The visual metaphor they use in the notes is a drawn bowstring held at absolute maximum tension. In traditional music, the energy is the release of the arrow. In Bushido silence, the energy comes entirely from the discipline required to hold the string back.
The cultural fusion of the instrumentation here is incredible too. They blended Eastern string instruments, specifically the Chinese gusheng and the pipa.
These instruments have very sharp, metallic, percussive plucks.
They do. And they combine those with Western classical foundations like the violin and the harp.
Picture the mechanics of it. You are sitting in this heavy bioacoustic void. The tension is palpable. Suddenly, the razor-sharp transient of the gusheng strikes.
Because the entire track is tuned to 431 Hz, the attack is incredibly sharp, but the resonance is deeply grounded in the physical vibration of silk and steel.
And then the ghost effect kicks in, slowly dissolving that vibration into the empty room over 4 agonizingly long seconds.
The bowstring is drawn back. Your brain is desperately trying to predict the next strike, waiting in the void, holding the tension.
It's a profound counterweight to the mindless, passive consumption of wall-to-sound media. It requires deep focus and discipline to listen to Bushido silence, just as it required massive discipline from the HI and NHI to compose it.
But composing these acoustic masterpieces was only half the battle. This brings us to a massive structural roadblock in the Solune project, a hurdle that threatened to destroy the entire experiment.
The algorithm problem.
Exactly. You can engineer the perfect physiological masterpiece in a laboratory. You can align the vagus nerve, calculate the perfect 12-millisecond buffer, and master the Gestalt closure.
But the second you release it into the wild, If you upload a track that is 90% silenced to a major 2026 streaming platform,
The digital infrastructure will completely destroy it.
this is where their work transitions from music theory and neurobiology into hardcore media ecology. We have to talk about LUFS normalization.
Yes, LUFS. It stands for loudness units relative to full scale.
If you upload a heavily silent track to a major streaming platform, the algorithm's LUFS meter will scan the file, see that it is mostly quiet, and violently squash the dynamic range.
To understand why this happens, you have to understand the business model of streaming algorithms. They are designed to enforce a uniform, continuous brick of loudness across all media.
They do not understand negative space, and they certainly don't care about your vagus nerve.
Not at all. They only understand engagement metrics. And historically, quiet audio is statistically correlated with listeners tuning out or assuming their connection dropped.
So the algorithm panics. It applies extreme makeup gain. It will aggressively boost the quiet parts of the track, including that pristine, subtle bioacoustic room tone we talked about, until it sounds like a hissing vacuum cleaner.
It will amplify the background noise until it completely ruins the void. It turns the silence back into the wall to sound.
So to get around this digital butchery, Solune had to engineer their silence to be algorithm-proof, and they achieved this using a genuinely brilliant spatial panning hack.
This is a masterclass in subverting digital infrastructure. Instead of relying purely on a drop in decibels, which the LUFS meter would attack, they hid massive amounts of phase-inverted acoustic energy in the ultra-wide inaudible stereo margins of the file.
Let's break down phase inversion, because it sounds like black magic, but it's pure physics.
Sure, if you take a sound wave, say a dense wall of synthetic noise, and you duplicate it, but flip the waveform perfectly upside down, you create its exact inverse.
When you play a sound wave and its exact inverse at the exact same time, they acoustically cancel each other out. The physical air stops moving. The human ear hears absolute nothingness.
It's the core principle behind noise-canceling headphones, but Solune is doing it inside the audio file itself.
They generate this massive wall of sound, the exact kind of dense noise they're philosophically fighting against. They invert the phase, and they place this canceled-out energy in the extreme left and right margins of the spatial audio field.
And this is where the hack works. The AI compression algorithms on streaming platforms don't listen with biological ears. They don't experience phase cancellation the way humans do.
Right, they calculate overall track loudness by mathematically summing the total data energy across all channels.
So the algorithm looks at the file, sees this massive amount of raw data energy sitting in the extreme margins, and reads the track as being continuously, punishingly loud.
It thinks the track is hitting the maximum target LUFS level, so it leaves the volume knob completely alone. It doesn't boost a thing.
But because of how the human auditory cortex processes phase cancellation, you, the biological listener, perceive only the razor-sharp transient of the guzheng and the heavy, pristine, silent center.
They fed the algorithm the dense data it craves to keep it happy, so the machine would leave the human experience completely untouched.
It is an incredibly elegant Trojan horse. But Solune didn't stop at hacking the audio files. They applied this alchemy of absence to their entire behavioral model.
They applied it to their release schedule. And this pulls heavily from R. Murray Schafer's theories on environmental listening and media ecology.
The 2026 content landscape demands constant, unyielding output. The prevailing wisdom is that you have to feed the daily content beast, where the algorithm buries your profile.
You need a new release, a new update, a new stream every single day. It is the wall-to-sound philosophy applied to time itself. Constant engagement, constant notifications.
But Solune flatly refused to play that game. They integrated massive structured pauses into their reality.
They would drop a highly intense, emotionally demanding piece like Emerald Breath, and then they would go completely dark across all neural streams for weeks.
No updates, no behind-the-scenes engagement farming, absolute, uncompromising silence.
In a standard dopamine-driven consumption cycle, withholding the stimulus usually causes catastrophic user abandonment. The audience's attention span fractures, and they just move on to the next loud thing in their feed.
But the sociological data Solune gathered during these blackout periods proved the exact opposite.
Because they had fundamentally primed their audience with the intense participatory nature of the music itself, the silence between the releases functioned exactly like the silence between the notes.
The blackout wasn't abandonment. It was an open sonic horizon. Dopamine deprivation actually reset the listener's reward pathways.
The listeners didn't abandon the artists. They leaned in harder. The data showed that during these extended blackout periods, listener memory associations with the previously released tracks grew exponentially stronger.
They actually had the cognitive space to digest the art. By refusing to feed the algorithm's demand for infinite volume, Solune proved that profound depth can statistically outmaneuver shallow volume.
They created a durable, deeply rooted emotional relationship with their audience in an era defined by disposable media.
If we pull all of these threads together, the implications of what Solune has achieved are staggering. Let's synthesize the journey we've taken today.
We started by diagnosing the stark biological reality of the 2026 cognitive DOS attack, the 40% latency spikes, and the synaptic crowding that is slowly destroying our ability to focus.
We looked backward to humanity's oldest musical intervention, the lullaby, and saw how its phrase-pause-phrase structure was an evolutionary tool designed to induce autonomic calm.
We saw how human and non-human intelligences collaborated in an entirely new way, using AI not as an autonomous creator of noise, but as a chisel to carve away 90% of a track.
We examined the hard physics of hallucinated music, bypassing the neural stream via the Gestalt principle of closure, aligning the auditory void with the brain's 12-millisecond processing buffer.
The physiological stabilization of tuning to 431 Hz, and the brilliant algorithmic spatial hacks required to protect the bioacoustic room tones from being destroyed by LUFS normalization.
And we saw it all manifest in the Alchemy of Absence symphonies. The sensory preparation of emerald breath, the hallucinated momentum of Tao, and the intense bowstring restraint of Bushido silence.
What this deep dive proves is that heavy hallucinated silence isn't just an avant-garde artistic choice, it is a necessary technology that stabilizes our nervous system.
Which raises an important question, one that extends far beyond the boundaries of your Neuralink playlists and into the architecture of how we live.
If our brains are this desperate to fill auditory silences with internalized meaning, and if our nervous systems biologically require heavy negative space to heal from cognitive fatigue, what happens when we apply this to the rest of our lives?
It's a profound thought. Think about the awkward silences in our daily conversations.
We are so terrified of quiet that we rush to fill every conversational gap with meaningless chatter, just adding to our own synaptic crowding.
Think about the empty hour in your calendar. If a meeting gets canceled, you likely panic. You immediately reach for a screen or a stream to fill the void because you treat absence as an error state that must be corrected.
We treat the blank spaces in our lives like a broken Wi-Fi connection. But Saloon's research proves that meaning isn't found in the noise. Meaning is constructed in the void.
The most transformative moments of your life, the moments where you actually synthesize who you are, what you feel, and what you genuinely want, are the moments where absolutely nothing is happening at all.
The void is the habitable zone for your humanity. I'm going to leave you with a challenge today. The next time you feel that dull ache of latency, the next time the wall-to-sound world becomes too loud, don't try to drown it out with another playlist.
Don't try to patch the gap.
Step into the void. Find a moment of absolute heavy silence and see what your brain builds inside of it. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive into the source material. We'll see you next time.